I'm Ari Redboard, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. On today's TRM Talks, I sit down with my friend and the new managing partner of Bellamentis, Teresa Goody Guillén. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. On today's Inside the Lab, we're talking about latency, because in this ecosystem, delay equals exposure. With illicit volume reaching 158 billion in 2025 and billions moving within minutes during major incidents, real-time ingestion is not an optimization, it's survival. Real-time blockchain ingestion means transactions are processed as they confirm, normalized across chains, and made immediately available for clustering, risk scoring, and network expansion. This changes investigative posture from retrospective analysis to live situational awareness. If funds are moving across 5 chains within 10 minutes, you cannot afford hourly data refresh cycles. You need contextual scoring and entity mapping in operational timeframes. In digital finance, velocity is the threat multiplier. Real-time analytics is the countermeasure. For much more on this, read the blog post from our engineering team on how they ingest blockchains in real time. And now, Teresa Goody Guillén. Today, I am joined by my friend, the founding partner of Bellamentis, and really one of the great legal minds in our space, Teresa Goody Guillén.
Thanks. It's great to see you. Great to talk to you.
Would you talk a little bit about your journey to becoming, I think, really one of the true expert lawyers in this space?
My journey, I think, is important in understanding, too, how I do approach all of this, because the journey is how my mind has evolved and how my thinking has evolved and my approaches. And I was really fortunate to have some amazing mentors, something that I think is underrated these days and harder to find. But I started my career actually in law school, going to school at night. So I put myself through college and law school and working full time. And I worked at a plaintiff's law firm, which was a different experience, certainly from now. And it was really helpful at the beginning because plaintiffs' law firms are a bit scrappy, and you get the opportunity to do so many things that, sometimes it takes people 10 years of their career to get to. So starting at a plaintiffs' law firm was really helpful. I was fortunate, it was one of the top I think 50 lawyers, trial lawyers in the United States. And so medical malpractice and other types of plaintiff's injuries. But at the highest level, it was Patrick Regan. He actually was one of the reasons that helped me get a clerkship later on in my career, was the fact that I had worked for him.
You mentioned mentors, which, a lot of people, young lawyers in particular, I think are listening to the show. And I often talk about, I did a federal clerkship in North Carolina for a really extraordinary judge named Malcolm Howard. He passed away recently. He's buried in Arlington. Just an amazing guy, Reagan appointee, so many years ago. And just like you have these people in your life who've really shaped it, it sounds like, I know you clerked for Judge Urbina in the DC District Court, place where I practiced for many years as well. Tell me about that experience for sure.
That really shaped my career immensely. And, the reason I did a clerkship first was I didn't feel like I was ready to practice law. And it's amazing how much confidence I got from that experience, because after I saw what people were doing, I thought, oh, I can do this.
Talk to me a little bit about your time at the SEC.
It was very helpful coming from, criminal defense work and investigations, civil and criminal work that I did at a big law firm, and then transitioning over to see from the regulator standpoint and the other standpoint. And it was really helpful just to see the operations even, and the resources constriction, more operational type of things were very insightful to me, and how it functioned and how people think. I started litigating on behalf of the commission, and then working more on some of the investigations that were going on internally. And this was after the financial crisis, and which was one of the reasons that drew me there, because with the financial crisis, I wanted to understand more about why that happened. How does that happen? What are our systems in place that keep that from happening or are involved in that, like where the guardrails? And so it was a lot of, again, my curiosity is what led me to the SEC, just being in this moment in time of wanting to know more about it. And so I really took that opportunity to learn. Luckily, I was in the office of the general counsel's office, so I could do this, all the different divisions. I had to work with all the different divisions for everything that I was working on. And so I learned a lot about enforcement. And then it was moving. So Harvey Pitt, former SEC chairman, poached me really from the SEC and asked me to come work with him. So otherwise, I would have stayed there longer. But how could I not accept a job with Harvey Pitt? The opportunity to work alongside like one of the most brilliant, I think, lawyers who's ever practiced. I learned to know and love the commission and securities laws even more with him, and almost like through his eyes. So that's another mentor who just completely changed the way that I think, the way that I lawyer.
You mentioned sort of like, obviously, like becoming this expert on, SEC, on securities law, your time at the commission, your time working with Harvey Pitt. I know you've worked at large law firms sort of doing this today. Was there a moment when digital assets really became front and center for you?
Yes, it's very clear in my mind. And so in 2015, Harvey was the first time somebody paid for my school. He sent me to go get an MBA. So
Wow.
I got an MBA, and I decided I wanted to launch my own law firm for the first time. But my first client wanted to do a swaps transaction, and the underlying asset was a digital asset. And there was no swaps regime. There were thousands of pages of proposed rules.
Yeah.
There was nothing on digital assets yet. And so I looked at it and I said, well, I could see this could be a commodity or a security. I can see the argument on both sides. So I called my friends at the SEC and my friends at the CFTC, and they both said, yes.
No idea.
Yes, I have jurisdiction.
Yeah, exactly.
And I was like, oh, that's so funny. You guys can't both have jurisdiction. Let's all get in a room and chat and just like talk this out.
10 years later, it has not been worked out.
But finally, we do have, Paul Atkins
Maybe.
and Mike Seelig talking,
yes.
right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
That's good.
That's cool. I love that perspective. That's amazing. And then honestly, was it from that first sort of engagement with a client that you realized, hey, this is a really interesting issue and I can have a unique perspective on it?
Yeah, it was. I always look at like, what is the goal you're trying to accomplish, right? How can we accomplish this goal when it looks like we can't do it this one way? And it was interesting because I had a lot of clients who came to me and I said, well, we can do your transactions one way, but that would be a securities transaction. So we have to follow one of the exemptions and do it that way. Or we can kind of change a little bit of the model that you're using right now. And if we can implement some technological changes, then we can put it into a different kind of category. And so two things, like we can do it either way, and I can find either solution. And they said, well, there's this big law firm and they said I can just do it this way. I said, okay, well, I do defense work too, so keep my card.
Yeah.
And so that really fascinated me. And then I don't know, you can't how people practice in this space without understanding the technology. So, like I taught digital law and policy at Georgetown too. And I remember the first painful time for the engineers, not painful for me, where we were walking through lines of code of a smart contract, and they were explaining to me what it did, and then I would tell them the legal implication of each of those. And it was a very helpful experience for me, although painful for them, I think.
Totally.
But
it's so important. People ask all the time, it's like, hey, how can I get more involved in this space or understand it better? And I'm always like, look, the space is the technology. and you've got to really start to understand it. I do not at all profess to be a data scientist or an engineer, but I've really tried to touch this stuff and play with it and spin up a MetaMask wallet and mess with NFTs and fund, a liquidity pool and work through those issues. I think it becomes really powerful in terms of your ability to engage with clients in that way. What are sort of like the major issues that clients are coming in with today in terms of your practice? And then I think there's a lot of questions right now, especially for US developers. While we have some really good guidance, if you will, from the SEC today that we didn't have even a few months or certainly a few years ago, CFTC, US Treasury, the Fed, we still don't have legislation. How are you thinking about navigating that right now for your clients?
Well, I have a lot of conversations with regulators, like I used to before the last administration. It's a similar approach that I had taken for most of my career, is going and talking to the regulators. And so we have a product, we have something. I'm working through a few different exemptive programs. People don't realize the breadth of the exemptive relief from the SEC and the CFTC. And it's nothing novel. Like Harvey and I used to do this all the time, going to the SEC and asking them for some exemptive relief, because you can basically exempt anyone or any transaction or any instrument as long as it fulfills certain requirements. Then you get these exemptive relief. So I'm doing that considerably. I talk to the crypto task force and make sure that what we're thinking about is not inconsistent. Obviously they can't provide me with any kind of specific information, but we want to make sure that the way that we're thinking about this is not something that's inconsistent with what the commissions are going to be doing or wanting to do. But they could fully regulate the markets without any legislation. I think legislation is really helpful and is necessary, certainly at some point, to have things codified. But their exemptive relief collectively would enable them to regulate the markets efficiently and effectively.
You're doing this, really from a different platform. You left leading two practice groups at a large law firm to start your own thing, which, as someone who joined a 7-person startup, 6 years ago after time in the government, it's like, there's nothing I admire or respect more than someone who kind of takes that step. You're building Bellamentis. I think of it as sort of like this whole group of experts on securities, on market structure, kind of coming together in a technology first type of way to build maybe like a new model of law firm. But I also want to start with like Bellamentis. Tell me about the name.
So the name means roughly, not exactly, but a beautiful mind. And, I am a fan of John Nash, and everything I do use, some of that in the game theory in my legal work. But it's more of, to me, the law is like this beautiful craft, and we don't see that as much. We don't see people practicing it as this craft. It's one of the oldest crafts, and it is so beautiful. And like the thought process and the minds and the thinking of it, to me, is just like, it's so fun. I get lost in it. This is why I write my own legislation in my spare time, because it's like, I just love it. Like, it's so fascinating to me, and all these puzzles. And so a lot of it is preserving this beautiful craft as a craft. And so we're very selective in the people who work at Bellamentis. They all are of extraordinarily high quality. And while it's a full service law firm, it's our flagship is financial and digital markets. And so the convergence of those. So you'll see everyone has expertise in traditional financial markets as well as digital markets.
Amazing. How do you sort of dig into an issue? How do you try to solve it?
It's like so fascinating to me, and it's so critical to get it right. And I feel like people just started just going without thinking. And like that prep process, that thinking process about how to approach something is the most important one. Then everything from there is following generally the plan. But, people just started originally just saying, is it a commodity or a security? And that's not the right question to me. And so what I did was I sat back and thought about, okay, what are these assets? And I did a lot of reading and contemplating. And the way that I think about them actually comes from a footnote written in the 30s by Adolf Berle, and, thinking more about how these different types of economic rights, property rights evolved through time. And I thought I always go back to history to learn, because history repeats itself and it's different. Things change, but you can always get lessons. So I started just looking, well, what did people do before? How did people approach analyzing new assets? We've obviously had them. And so I just did a deep dive into like economic treatises of legal principles and the evolution of the corporate structure. And when you started separating ownership and control, because that's what a lot of this came down to with these assets, was what are the rights and liabilities? Like, what's the bundle of rights? What does this do? So he separates it into passive property and active property. And so passive property is when a shareholder has passive property, and then the active property is management, and they're working. And it was fascinating because when you separated those two, and you could have a shareholder separate from the company managers and controllers, they actually analyzed, does the owner still have the same economic rights in that property as they did before when they controlled it? And they went through that analysis. And it made me think even deeper about what are all of these rights. And so the footnote, he said, at some point, we could possibly have a passive property right and active property. So it's having a passive right in the control of a company, which is basically a governance token. And so when I read it, and he says, but that's for another day. We don't have, anything like that, and that's not even possible right now. So it's for another day. And I was like, that day is today. How amazing that Adolf Berle thought of this, this could happen, this principle. And he already did a bunch of the work for us in setting up how to look at it. He already started that. And so then I followed a little bit of his teaching, and with economic treatises and property treatises, securities treatises, all sorts of different things that I just read to think about it. And then I came up with how I would approach it if I were to start from scratch.
I love so much about this. The process, quite frankly, is the most interesting part. There's a historic perspective. There's this technology perspective. Obviously, Bellamentis has that feel, obviously, all over it, just given your leadership and who you are. I do have this sense in terms of really leaning in technology. I know you're building AI tools, AI legal tools to really leverage for Bellamentis and beyond. Just talk me a little bit through what it means to be sort of a technology-first law firm and how you're thinking about the use of AI in legal practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really critical in something that is, I feel it's like that saying, if you can, you must, and I feel like I can, and therefore it's almost like I have a duty and I must. And I see the way that AI is being used in the legal practice, and it really lessening the quality of our lawyering and lessening the quality of lawyers' product. And it's helpful because being the CEO of an AI company, as the founding and managing partner of a law firm, gives me quite an advantage of being able to, create and implement these things together. So Sophie Lex is not just my daughter, Sophia, but Sophia means wisdom. And Lex, everybody knows it means law, but it also means defender of mankind. And so this is this wise platform of law that we're creating that helps to defend mankind. The practice of law is so critical to me, and I don't know that it's really fully appreciated how our democracy depends on it. Our entire society depends on it.
How do you approach this from a legal tech perspective, or even sort of I know you don't believe that lawyers are going to be replaced by this stuff, but some people do. Talk me through just what you're building with Sophie Lex, and then how you kind of see this just really civilization changing moment that we're in.
Yeah, I don't think that it will replace lawyers, but it will replace certain things that they do. And AI could be used to really amplify and scale lawyers. And that's how we're using it at Bellamentis. And that's what we're developing at Sophie Lex. Because I came up with this because I kept having to work 48 hours straight and over and over again. And that's just not sustainable because there was so much work and there was so much to do to get it right. And so I started researching, well, how could I not duplicate myself, but scale? How could I create a mini? I always say I need a Teresa. And so I started researching it, and this gets to like how it developed, and I am fortunate enough to have friends and clients who are just the visionaries in technology, in blockchain and AI, and talking to them through this and walking through it, and also being able to understanding the technology that's being applied to law, where you have these more generic type of frontier models that are using generally a vector predictive method to come up with the answers and responses, and then kind of putting it on top of law. And we're approaching it differently, and we are creating a lot of our own proprietary AI, and it's implementing some of like my reasoning, and not all my reasoning, not all my secret sauce.
Yeah,
but,
no, I get it. AI is these incredibly powerful tools, but we can't forget they're only as powerful as the experts that are building the agents.
And then also, the data, it can only answer the data that it has. Right. And so I will go in and type in a question, and it'll tell me, oh, I can't make that argument. There's no legal precedent. Well, that's not true. There is legal precedent for that. It's just not in that data set that they have. And, and I run into this. This is another thing with the curiosity and the willingness of lawyers to still operate in that way where they go to find the answer. So even when I was at a big law firm, I had other partners and associates coming to me saying, oh, I can't find precedent for that. I'm like, oh, yes, you can. You're just not looking in the right place. You just have to go beyond these couple of, data sets that you go to, and you can look here and here. And sometimes you have to do a pacer search in one court to find a case because you know that it is going to have a document in there that will direct you to another court. And that's the document you need. But people are not like thinking enough. And we have to go so fast. Like there's so many things to do. And that's why I think AI is so important to scale and amplify, but not replace, because you can have something where it automatically does some of these processes for you. And so you can get those types of documents. But then if you just give an AI tool saying, go find me a precedent, and it's just going to come back and say no, well, that's not the useful tool. Right. The useful tool is the one that can actually find the document, right?
Yeah.
If it exists.
Do the work, for sure.
Yeah. And so it's helping to implement that process. And I want all lawyers to be their best lawyers. And the fact that there's so much legal work and more legal work that has to be done, it has to be done so quickly, that I think all lawyers need this. This is why I'm creating something that's, will be available to everyone, like all lawyers, whether solo or big law or in-house. And then the next stage is for something for everyone. Like it shouldn't be so hard and expensive to know what your rights are. My daughter's 4. She does not consent to searches. Like everyone.
Amazing. Amazing. I love that. Lawyer up. You heard it here. 7 years old, lawyer up. Call my mother. Exactly. Get my mother on the phone. Going back to the SEC, your name has come up a time or two over the last couple of years as a potential candidate for chair of the SEC, which is not surprising when people hear you talk. How did that make you feel? And yeah, like any perspective on when that type of thing happens?
It was an honor and a privilege just to even be considered. And especially with the company I was in. So I think the world of Paul Atkins, and he, of course, was a commissioner when Harvey was chairman. And so I've got the opportunity to work with him when I was particularly at Calorama. And so to be, thought of and considered, alongside him is an honor.
I mean, he really has come in and sort of revolutionized in many ways the way the SEC thinks about technology, I think broadly. And I love his talking point around how we need to modernize regulations and encourage innovation, right? At the end of the day, that's the most important thing. It's the outcome is encouraging innovation, encouraging builders to build in the United States. How do you see like the priorities, particularly through that lens, as he's talked about that? And obviously it's so interesting now. You're building a technology company, you're building a law firm. Like I feel like there's so much interesting interplay there.
I'm so thrilled with everything that he and the CFTC chairman, Mike Seelig, have been doing. And he exactly is approaching it the same way that I do, and taking a step back and modernizing it. But is like, what is the point? We don't have regulation just to have regulation, right? It serves a purpose. Why does it exist in the first place? Does that reason even still exist? And then with technology, we need to be using technology and not getting behind. We can't have everything going offshore. But then, so does the technology, does it reduce a certain risk, or does it create a risk, amplify a risk? Like, let's assess it for what it is. Very common sense. He is so practical and so thoughtful, and just of common sense of, let's answer the basic questions.
It does almost feel like these are questions that the industry's been asking for years. Let's just answer them. I mean, is that kind of like where we see this steady drumbeat of that happening? What other things have you sort of seen that you've been like, okay, yes, now I have an answer for a client who comes in with this question today?
Yeah, well, one, too, is the openness to actually have these conversations and take a position and be able to like stand behind that position. And I think he's taking on this monumental task, and the industry, we need to help support him. And this is how the SEC used to operate, and this is how we had the markets develop in the 40s and the 50s, 70s. Was this kind of similarly, and moving everything on chain. Like, what does that mean? How can industry help? What are the solutions? Like, be forward thinking, be problem solvers. And he encourages that. And that's where we should be. Our market should be on chain. And I think the SEC and the CFTC have to be so coordinated. And, you do need to have these different assets transacting on the same platform, because one of the most overlooked risks is derivatives risk. Yeah. So even just calling something a security and then saying it's a security and it'll be regulated that way, if it actually has a large part of a derivatives aspect to it, that really doesn't help the investor, right? Or purchaser, consumer, whoever. And so, purpose fit, just very commonsensical. He's doing so many things that are Herculean tasks, each one in its own, but then there's so many, and the disclosure regimes that have just gone out of control. So sunlight being the best disinfectant, yes, but I always give Troy Prees the credit for this, but sunlight is also blinding. So
yeah, you are you're so practical, and I think that it's so critical and refreshing to hear this. Teresa, thank you for joining TRM Talks. It's interesting. That conversation was actually a lot different in terms of like the things that were key takeaways for me than I thought going in. I thought I was going to talk about sort of, the 5 issues facing the SEC today and having sort of Teresa break them down. But this was much better. And I thought what you heard really was from a lawyer's lawyer on how to represent clients. But really more than that, it's how do you dig into the hardest issues? And you go back in history and you look at footnotes from 1930s and you kind of break it down and you go line by line through the code with the builders who are building this technology to understand it, to say, hey, this line of code makes sense, but you really need to understand this regulatory angle to it. And this is really someone who's gone deep in the technology from a legal perspective, from a legislative perspective. And it just shows what it really takes to dig into an idea. And I love that her new firm, Bellamentis, is Beautiful Mind, because I'm picturing this graph from the movie or whatever, where she's really, working so hard to dig into these issues at the highest level. So I think just so much about what she's learned from her mentors about practicing law, the beauty of the practice of law. As someone, my father is a solo practitioner in New Jersey who is an advisor to his clients in like the most real sense of the word. And I feel like that's the beauty of the law that I've always seen in my life. And I love the way Teresa was describing the beauty of law in her practice. On the next TRM Talks, I sit down with Brad Brown of Australia's Austrac. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. And follow us on LinkedIn to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, Let's get back to building.